Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to explore education in parapsychology. With me is Professor Charles Tart, an emeritus professor of psychology at the University of California at Davis, as well as an emeritus professor at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. Dr. Tart is a past president of the Parapsychological Association. He has authored over 100 scientific papers in parapsychology and many books, including the classic anthology Altered States of Consciousness. Some of his other titles include Psi, Scientific Studies of the Psychic Realm, and Open Mind, Discriminating Mind, and Waking Up, and Learning to Use Extrasensory Perception. Dr. Tart, incidentally, was one of my faculty members at Berkeley when I worked on my own doctoral degree in parapsychology there. Welcome, Charlie.
Good to be here, Jeff.
It's a pleasure to be with you, and I know we have a long history together going back to the early 1970s, so it's especially nice to be with you.
Yeah, I'm sure when you initially contacted me, I gave you my standard letter to discourage you from getting into weird stuff like this, and you were one of those young idealists who didn't pay no attention to it. Because that's how I was anyway.
We both were, and we both followed very different paths because you've really been in mainstream academia throughout your entire career.
Mm-hmm.
Which is kind of rare for a parapsychologist.
It's extremely rare, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's fair to say, I know at least one of your students, Etzel Cardania, who I believe was a student of yours at Davis, mm-hmm. and has gone on to become a professor of parapsychology in Sweden.
Parapsychology and hypnosis, actually, I think is the special chair that he occupies. But to start adding a note of realism, he was able to get that position because the university was left a substantial inheritance by someone who specified that it should be a professorship dealing with parapsychology and hypnosis. Mm-hmm. It's unlikely the university on its own would have ever looked for a professor to deal with parapsychology.
In fact, I recall a time when I think it was the Parapsychology Foundation approached the University of Southern California, and they had funds to endow a chair, and the university refused to accept it.
Now, let's not discourage people too fast. Okay? Let me quickly counter this, okay? I think the question of whether we have a real spiritual nature or whether, as the materialists say, we're basically all a chemical accident that means nothing, is about the most important question human beings can deal with, because mm-hmm. it affects your whole outlook on life and what you do and so forth. Mm-hmm. Parapsychology and transpersonal psychology are attempts to bring the power and discipline of science to bear on questions about it. So it's not a matter of you believe in something spiritual or you don't believe in it. It's a matter of, do you have evidence indicating that this is probably true or this is probably false, mm-hmm. and so forth. Because it's so important. You know, if I say to you, Jeff, I don't really need you anymore and I can get away with it, so I think I'm going to kill you because I've got a nice insurance policy on you. Well, I've just stopped some chemical reactions. Big deal, as long as I can get away with it. Mm-hmm. But if I think there's a real sense in which we're spiritual beings and are intimately linked, and something like compassion and love is a real and important part of the universe, that changes everything. You don't do things like that. Mm-hmm. So wouldn't it be nice to have some evidence one way or the other? So what we're going to talk about is important, even though practically there's a lot of difficulties.
Well, there are those who say that this is an area that should be relegated to religion, or this is an area where it's impossible to come up with any evidence. Logically, philosophically, whatever evidence you come up with will fall short in any case.
Well, you know, one of the ways I like to tease some of my religious friends is asking them, has there been any progress in science in the last couple of centuries? And of course, you know, enormous progress.
Mm-hmm.
Has there been any progress in religion and spirituality? Are a higher percentage of people who try to get enlightened getting enlightened? Are a higher percentage getting saved? And, you know, they're taken aback by my asking the question.
Uh-huh.
Religion is pretty much where it was 1,000 years ago, believe it or else. But there's been no progress. There's been no experimentation, for instance, to find out what aspects of religion are probably true and what indeed are just cultural artifacts or superstitions or power plays for political reasons and so forth. But we desperately need to apply our intelligence to this question of, are we spiritual beings or just animated meat?
This is a question that William James began to explore over 100 years ago, 130, 40 years ago, both in terms of psychical research and in terms of the scientific and academic study of religion, and in terms of developing a scientific psychology. He made great progress in his own lifetime, and I would imagine if things had progressed along the outlines that he began to develop, we would have very active disciplines.
Yes, very much so. But it didn't work that way.
It didn't work out that way because if I think about it, it's largely the influence of behaviorism. In psychology, for example, for 50 years, consciousness was almost a taboo subject, consciousness.
If you ask people, what's the pecking order in science, okay? Where are the physicists and the economists? Well, the physicists are real scientists and they get exact results. And economy, that's the dismal science. Where are psychologists? They're way down there somewhere with the economists and so forth. Now, people who are interested in psychology didn't like that, so they tried to make psychology into a socially acceptable science as well as one that was actually finding out. And that meant in all sorts of ways just copying the physical sciences, right? I mean, I've got a white lab coat somewhere that I used to bring out when I had to pose beside my electronic equipment for media people and whatnot. And I didn't really need a white lab coat to keep the chemical stains off my suit or something. But there's that belonging. As one of my professors once said in graduate school, you know, it's only been 100 years since they let us out of the philosophy department. As psychologists, we're afraid they'll send us back. And that tells you where philosophers are in the pecking order among scientists. They're way down there.
They are way down.
One famous scientist put it as something like, scientists need philosophers like birds need ornithologists. Interesting, strange little hobby.
I know the philosophers have a different point of view.
Yeah, they have a different point of view, but they don't do any experiments, and they can't make any nuclear weapons to threaten the rest of us with. Now, it's stupid because, I mean, philosophers can really contribute to making us understand what we're doing. And when a field of science runs into some crisis, things are just not making sense anymore, then they're liable to start thinking about the philosophy and how that's affecting what kind of questions they ask, how they ask them. So it's important. Now, but you're right, of course, in saying behaviorism threw consciousness out of psychology. It was so strange. You know, predict behavior, the stuff you could really see. But even after it had been around for more than 50 years, when I was in graduate school, it was still quite clear that if you wanted to predict what somebody was going to do next, and that's the criteria that you have a scientific theory that works, it predicts, far and away the best thing to do is not look at their behavior, but to ask them, hey, what you going to do next? Really useful. Tap into their consciousness.
Well, an interesting thing is that that's where psychology started. It was the methodology of the early experimental psychologists was introspection. Look inside your mind and tell me what you see. And that line of research was pretty much dropped.
For good reasons. It had major flaws in it.
Yeah.
For one thing, there was no real understanding that it's hard to observe your mind. Your mind is going a mile a minute. I remember, for instance, when I was trying to learn meditation from a Tibetan Lama, Tart, and he used to talk about finding the space between thoughts. And I thought, what a fascinating idea, the space between thoughts.
Yeah.
No space between my thoughts, zip, zip, this, that, the other thing. It's hard to observe yourself.
Yes.
In the meditative traditions, they talk about people who can really start understanding how the mind works because maybe they've practiced for 5,000 or 10,000 hours to really get it together. A trained observer in early psychology was somebody who had 10 hours of training. They didn't know how to observe. And there was a tremendous authoritarianism, too. A lot of it was happening in Germany. And Herr Doctor Professor knew how the mind worked and had some assistants to make observations to prove that point. And your job depended on Herr Doctor Professor liking you. So there was all sorts of bias and the like.
Yeah. Well, it's intriguing to me that the field of psychical research, which is sort of the forerunner of parapsychology, and it's a term still used today, got off the ground formally in 1882. That's around the same time that psychology itself it was established as an independent discipline separate from philosophy. The two of them were operating in parallel for a while, and there were some great contributions from the early psychical researchers, but over time, parapsychology and psychical research got relegated to a fringe position within academia, and psychology, exclusive of the paranormal, became mainstream.
Yeah. Well, there were many reasons for it, of course, but remember what I said. We were afraid they'd send us back to the philosophy department. We wanted to be accepted as real scientists, and that means we had to look like real scientists and talk like real scientists who were all in the material sciences. So we had to become materialists, and materialists immediately ruled out everything psychic. You know, take, for instance, a central idea in any spiritual discipline or religion, prayer. From a materialist viewpoint, what is prayer? Talking to yourself. If you talk out loud, the sound may get around to the walls of the room. It's probably not going to get past. If you pray in your own mind, it doesn't even get that far. So prayer is a waste of time. Oh, yeah, maybe it'll make you feel better or something like that. But here comes psychical research in parapsychology investigating telepathy and starting to collect evidence that one human mind can pick up information that's in another human mind outside the room, a mile away, 100 miles away. Oh, wait a minute, if prayer involves telepathy, maybe we can't dismiss it as just talking to yourself. I mean, maybe sometimes that's what it is, but we have a glimpse of a mechanism whereby prayer could get information from one place to another.
Well, suppose you have a student today who is interested in exploring this further, would like to do research and become a professional expert on the power of prayer from a scientific point of view. How would you advise them to proceed?
I have an almost standard procedure, which unfortunately starts by my asking them, are you independently wealthy? Because if you can take this as a hobby and support yourself, a lot of things you could do. But if you have to earn a living, you've got to look like a scientist by mainstream criteria, get a degree in a graduate school, get grants to support your research and so forth. And if you show an interest in parapsychological matters, you probably won't even be accepted in graduate school. I mean, I know of some of the few academic parapsychologists, for instance, who if a student applied to their graduate program and mentioned their research on parapsychology, they were automatically rated as not all that bright. And since graduate schools only take a fraction of those who apply, they don't even get in. So, you know, it seems to me stupid, but I've always had to advise people, if you have these interests, two things have to happen. You have to have conventional interests too. so you can work in some aspect of psychology or physics or something, and it'll be satisfying and you'll make a living through it. But also as you go through graduate school and even through much of your academic career, be very careful who you talk to. Because a lot of people who are designated as scientists, who are supposed to be open-minded and go just by evidence, are totally prejudiced in rejecting the very possibility of telepathy, prayer, anything parapsychological. And they will attack you for making you uncomfortable by mentioning these possibilities. This is so stupid to tell graduate students to be very careful what you talk to with your professors.
They will attack you for making them uncomfortable.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Well, you know, when people come to me, I would give them the same advice, pretty much. It's good, solid advice. But at the same time, I feel obliged to tell people I didn't follow that advice myself. I was neither independently wealthy, nor did I really have and apply any kind of credentials or expertise in an area outside. I do have a master's degree in criminology, but I haven't really worked professionally in that area. So,
well, some people might think you're sort of a criminal for promoting parapsychology.
Some people indeed might, and one could say I'm a deviant.
Yes, definitely.
In that regard. But I think actually probably if you look at the population, everybody's a little bit deviant in one way or another. I haven't seen anybody who's perfectly normal in every respect.
Well, I was just like you. I didn't follow this good advice, okay, because I have a strong sense of right and wrong, and I have enormous respect for scientific method, and that requires you to be completely honest and open about the data, the stuff you can observe, and you're thinking about it. But luckily, I had a lot of more mainstream interests too. So when I got in graduate school, I focused my work on dream research, which was a hot new topic then when we discovered there were brainwave correlates of dreaming and the like. And I kept at least 2/3 of my research on things like dream research or hypnosis research, which were relatively respectable compared to parapsychology. But I didn't hide the parapsychology, and I suffered a great deal for it. I don't regret it because that's me. I'm honest about my interests.
Yeah. And in spite of all the suffering, and I'm sure it was quite real for you, you still managed to obtain tenure, and you are now an emeritus professor.
That's right. But I wasted at least a year or two of my career if I start thinking of all the time I had to defend against attacks. Now, it was strange. In my university, for instance, there were a lot of people who pointed to my research as an example of how the university upholds the principle of academic freedom. And if you're doing quality research, you can do it in anything. And there were a lot of other people who worked on getting me fired. Luckily, they didn't succeed. But so that's the advice I give people. Find some conventional area of science that you think probably would be relevant to parapsychology. Psychology is an obvious one. Physics probably something like that. And find one that's interesting enough to you that you'll enjoy working hard in, because you got to work hard to get through graduate school. But then keep the interest in parapsychological stuff kind of muted until you get tenure. And let's hope they still keep giving people tenure. I mean, administrators love to get rid of it, so it's easier to fire people, unfortunately.
Well, yeah, there are big changes going on in academia.
Yes. And I hope, incidentally, that the culture changes in a way that my cautionary words become totally obsolete and quaint as soon as possible.
Well,
but
I'm
humans
doing
don't change
these
easily.
interviews, Charlie, because I think the day is going to come when, and maybe 100 years from now, when mainstream colleges and universities around the world will have departments of parapsychology or something comparable, just as they have psychology and philosophy and criminology and other specializations now. And I think
hope so too.
These conversations will be useful for people when that day arrives.
Let me give you another example of why psychologists particularly are irrationally opposed to parapsychology. I mean, partly it's because it's not material, so that don't look like real scientists. But standard psychological experiments mean that if you control sensory communication, what you tell a subject in an experiment, you are in complete control of what they know about the experiment. So your opinions, your biases don't matter. But if you allow for telepathy, and we don't know when it might work or not work, a subject can find out what's supposed to happen. One of my areas of research was the question of experimenter bias. You know, like Rosenthal's research where he told some teachers that certain students were bright and others that they were kind of dumb, and supposedly the teachers treated everybody the same, but the achievement of the students varied enormously. Bias can totally control how an experiment comes out. If you allow telepathy in as another way of treating bias, I think that's really frightening to most psychologists. So ignore telepathy, it doesn't exist, so don't have to worry about that. But that's not realistic.
The implications are very significant. Even if it's a weak phenomenon, if it's influencing social science and behavioral research.
Many of the findings of psychology have a size, have a magnitude that's comparable to what you get in ESP experiments sometimes. That's scary. And I don't have good answers to the problem of bias. You know, the main answer I start with is know thyself. If you know what your biases are, then you might be able to reduce their influence. If you just assume you're an objective observer or an experimenter, then your biases can run riot.
Well, I know there's a big movement in the social and behavioral sciences now to focus on what are called questionable research practices, and that a great deal of conventional research is now being called into question.
Should be.
It's hard to replicate. It contradicts. One study will contradict another, and it's not nearly as neat and clean-cut as it often appears in your introductory freshman textbooks.
And it's well below the level of quality in what parapsychology experiments have been like for the last half century. Because many of these questionable research practices were things thought of in parapsychology to begin with. You know, like selectively throwing out some data because it didn't make sense and not telling anybody that. Realized long ago, you can't do that. You've got to account for all the data. So another requirement for success in parapsychology is you'd better be very, very honest and ready to be disappointed sometimes when experiments don't work out or you have to question stuff you'd rather believe. And you're going to have to put up with a lot of crap from colleagues who should be open-minded.
Well, and I think part of the reason for that is, as we've been hinting, parapsychology, it challenges established paradigms. Parapsychology requires people, if they take it seriously, to rethink a lot of things they thought they could take for granted and would never have to rethink.
The dominant view of consciousness now, and I'm glad we're actually doing consciousness research at last, but the dominant view is kind of neurophysicalism, that consciousness is produced simply by the action of neurons in the brain. Well, all your parapsychological phenomena like telepathy, clairvoyance, remote viewing and stuff says mind is not limited to the brain. The brain's important, but I like, for instance, as a working hypothesis, Aldous Huxley's characterization of the brain as a reducing valve, that our mind in some spiritual sense is capable of taking in everything about the universe, everywhere. But of course, that would be extremely distracting ordinarily, you know. When you're driving your car, you don't want voices coming in, talking to you. You want to be able to focus on things that have immediate relevance. So this very basic paradigm, which really is dominant, you know, if you get the right brain scanner, you'll explain everything about consciousness. No, you'll explain a lot of things, okay? An analogy I often use is what we ordinarily think of as mind is like a car and a driver. You can see what the car does. You can study how the car is built, why it works the way it does. But sometimes the driver gets out of the car and does things all different from what a car can do, or what a car and driver can do. And you have to look at the driver too. Parapsychology is ultimately going to be the study of the driver, of this quote, non-physical. I put quotes around it because I can't define it very well, but there's something else than what's just physical. And that's super important.
Yeah.
If we have a spiritual nature and should be focusing on those sorts of things instead of what can I do biologically to make myself happy and get away with, that controls the way we live.
And so you're talking basically about questioning metaphysical assumptions that are implicit in the society. And interestingly enough, since we've talked about the influence of the behaviorists, there's also the positivists in philosophy who have argued that metaphysical assumptions of any kind are out of bounds. They should never be discussed at all. I think Wittgenstein said at one point they should be passed over in silence.
Yeah, when I'm not following the conversation, I think people shouldn't talk about things I don't know about, but that's about my limits, not about reality.
Yeah.
I also want to object to your use of the term metaphysical assumptions, because that sounds like very abstract things that have nothing to do with ordinary life. These assumptions control our ordinary life. Some of them are kind of built in as biological apps that control it, but a lot of them are the beliefs our culture gives us, and they control how we perceive, how we think about things, how we react to things. They're not just metaphysical in some abstract sense.
Well, Charlie, as we wrap up this interview, it seems to me that one of the main themes is that for a young person wanting to go into this field, and I suspect there are thousands out there really.
Oh, I know. I get letters from them.
They need to know there are going to be many, many obstacles. And I'm reminded of the time I interviewed Joseph Campbell, and I asked him, well, what is your advice to young people? And he smiled and he said, follow your passion. I think you have to have a passion or you won't get through all the obstacles.
That's right. But don't assume you can make a living just by writing books about it either, because the situation of authors is pretty miserable nowadays.
Yes.
Most people will still have to earn a living, so you got to take that into account.
And
but
in my case,
don't sell out.
It just parenthetically, I might say, in my case, it helped that I had kind of an entrepreneurial spirit and was willing to kind of make my own way in the world, and suffered a lot of knocks along the way, but kept going.
And gave you a freedom to explore these things that you wouldn't have had otherwise.
Yeah, and I'm still going as this moment expresses itself, and I love it.
You first interviewed me 30 or 40 years ago, but I must say you don't seem to have slowed down in the slightest.
It's so great to be with you, Charlie. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jeff.
And thank you for being with us.